Welcome to Rainy Day Recess. This is week 8 of the Big Three briefing series, where we're tracking bills in our state legislature related to the key funding priorities for school districts across Washington. I'm Christie Robertson, a parent in Seattle Public Schools and co-producer of the podcast. And my co-host for this series is Megan Larkin.
Yes. Hi. I have 2 kids in Seattle Public Schools, and I am a big fan of the Big Three.
And the Big Three again?
The Big Three areas are special education, MSOC, which stands for Material Supplies and Operating Costs, and student transportation. These are areas that have the biggest funding gaps between what districts get from the state and what they actually spend. So getting the Big Three helps all of Washington's 295 districts and 1.1 million kids.
We're tracking a small set of bills related to these Big Three priorities as they navigate the legislative process as a way to educate folks and ourselves on how the process works. And wow, what a week.
Oh boy, yeah.
Megan, do we need to change the series to call it the Big Two?
I refuse to give up. So it is true that we have our first official bill deaths because the cutoff to get out of the fiscal committee was Friday the 28th. And the 2 transportation bills did not advance. So RIP Senate Bill 5187 and House Bill 1579. We hardly knew ye.
And does that mean there's no hope of any transportation funding?
So it would have been ideal. If you recall, what we were wanting in our transportation bills was ideally reworking the transportation formula through OSPI. So that's off the table now that the bills are dead. But now we got to go to plan B, which is hoping for a proviso in the budget.
And a budget proviso is kind of a way of assigning money to something that didn't make it through in the traditional way by having a bill pass.
Yes. We want that provision that the bills had for $400 a head for McKinney-Vento students. And ideally, we would like to add another highly mobile population into that mix. So kids in the foster care system. We would also like to include our students with disabilities who require additional transportation services. So the shorthand for this is we want money for special passengers. We have gotten a proviso in past years, but the budget climate now is so tight that it's probably going to be a bigger lift, but we're still going to try. So it's still the Big Three.
Just one of the 3 has to be back-channeled.
Yes.
And if folks are wanting to keep pushing for transportation funding, they just would mention to their legislators, make sure to keep transportation in mind in the budget. Is that kind of the phrasing?
I believe so. It'll be interesting to see how the budget writing process unfolds. On March 14th, there'll be a new revenue forecast released. And around March 25th, I'm hearing that the Majority Caucus is going to have a draft of their budget. And then I know there's all kinds of bills for revenue and things like that, and lots of conversations happening. So within the next couple of weeks, we should have a better picture of what kind of budget provisos are reasonably going to be out there.
Oh, okay. All right. So the 2 transportation bills died. And that's just the beginning of the bloodbath.
Yeah.
We do have 2 surviving MSOC bills and 2 surviving special ed bills, but there were all kinds of changes in those arenas.
Yes. It's sad.
It's sad. And should we start with the sadness that is the special education bills?
Yes. Yeah, that was gut-wrenching.
Yeah. So in the House, we had our favorite special education bill, 1310, which was sponsored by Rep. Paulette, who is our excellent special ed and education advocate from the 46th district in Seattle. And that bill had everything we wanted. So we were all very excited to see that 1310 was scheduled for an exec session in appropriations. And everybody was very relieved. Oh my gosh, it's really going to get voted on, until Wednesday at 11:03 a.m., where it was unceremoniously removed from the schedule and replaced with the bill 1357.
Yes.
And what I want to do at this point is to walk through all the features that were in House Bill 1310 so that we can keep those features in mind and make sure that some version of those features, the best version we can get of those features, is in whatever bill goes through in the end. First of all, it had a ton of extra money for special education. It really would have filled a huge amount of our gaps. And it did this by raising the multipliers districts get for kids getting special ed services on top of their general education apportionment. It would have raised the multiplier from 1.2 to over 1.5, so a big percentage increase. Second, it would have given funding to the state superintendent's office, OSPI, to continue projects that encourage inclusion and to address disproportionality. Third, it would have removed the percentage cap on funding for kids that are getting special ed services, which has been incrementally raised over the years. But really, many in the disability community consider it to be a real offense to say that you're only going to fund a certain percentage of disabled students in your schools. Every kid who's identified with a disability needs to be served and therefore should be funded by the state. Fourth, there's a technical fix in that bill to make sure that there isn't a penalty for districts that do a better job, including kids getting special ed services into gen ed classrooms. Fifth, it tells OSPI to develop a statewide IEP system so that we can start addressing some of our difficulties in special education on a larger scale. Sixth, there's a decrease in the safety net threshold. The safety net is a pot of money that kicks in for kids whose costs are significantly more than the services for other kids. This especially comes into play for students who are sent out of state or to like a residential school. And so the threshold defines at what point the state will kick in money, which is really pretty strange because the district is just left funding the gap in between. This bill would have lowered the threshold, making that money available for more kids. And lastly, 1310 would have allowed these safety net payments to go out quarterly, which helps especially smaller districts who are having to front that whole cost and then get repaid later. It's very difficult for budgeting. So a ton of improvements to the special education funding system that had been asked for a very long time. They were all in there.
Yes. And I think it's important to remember all that stuff that Christie just said, because those are the things that we want. And at the end of the day, those things can be shoved into all kinds of different bills. At this point in this session, I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves of that, because tragedy can befall bills, such as 1310. R.I.P.
Do you want to talk about 1357, Megan?
Yes. 1357, at least in its original form, was woefully inadequate. So just for context, SPS's special education budget gap is $74 million, and I think 1357 would have added something like $100 million total for the entire state. So it wasn't enough. There was no real OSPI inclusion funding, just funding for 25 pilot programs, no statewide IEP, no cap removal, no quarterly safety net. The safety net threshold barely budged. So a lot of people started freaking out when, oh no, 1310 is off the schedule and we've got 1357. And you could really understand that, right? Like it's heartbreaking.
Oh, yeah. And about half of the community, I would say, started madly writing to everybody saying, put 1310 back. And another half of the community said, take all the stuff from 1310 and put it in 1357. And what ended up happening was that a lot of the stuff from 1310 in a drastically reduced way got added to 1357 in executive session.
Yep. And to give folks a context around this, like obviously I haven't had one-on-one heart-to-hearts with the House Appropriations Committee, but what I would bet happened is that they took one look at the fiscal note for 1310 as it came to them, and they were like, nope, that's billions, and I see the budget deficit, and we're just not going to do billions. So we're going to either strip 1310 way back or add some stuff to 1357 and beef it up a bit. So even if we had saved 1310, it wouldn't really have been saving 1310, if that makes sense.
Right. It might have turned into basically what 1357 is now.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think they were going to give us what's in 1357, whether that stuff is in 1357 or in 1310 doesn't matter as much because we're focusing on the stuff.
If you're tracking 1310 and you've got your email alerts on, you can take those off and put your email alerts on 1357 because that's what we'll be watching from here on out in the House.
Yes.
Let's talk about what was added to 1357. There was one piece that has not been in any of the other funding bills, which was related to isolation of kids. First of all, I should say that the restraint and isolation bills in the House and the Senate both died on Friday, as they are wont to do. But Representative Callan, who has sponsored the House bill for the last 3 years, she is also on the Appropriations Committee. And she managed to get one tiny piece of her bill into 1357. And that piece is that it would request OSPI to develop a plan to prohibit isolation of K-5 kids by 2032.
Wow.
So that would be 7 years from now, which tells me that kids who are born today may still be forced into isolation rooms before that plan comes to fruition. So
crazy.
What I've been trying to focus my advocacy on this session is the 0.5% set aside for OSPI to develop its inclusionary practices. And that is in all the special ed funding bills that are alive right now. So it's very important to keep that in.
Yes, totally agree. And the thinking around that is if they do get this inclusionary practices training, that will mean that teachers will have alternatives to isolation and restraint.
Yeah, nobody ever wants to isolate or restrain a child. Those are practices that happen when a kid is escalated. And when teachers are under-resourced and don't have the training or the support to essentially prevent escalation. And there's lots of great tactics that have been developed that can help kids to really feel much better in school and not go through that escalation process. One of the main people developing these methods and helping people use them is Russ Green, who has really transformed a lot of districts around the country in terms of reducing their use of isolation and restraint. If anybody is at all interested in the topic of better ways to manage children who have big behaviors, look up Ross Green's work at livesinthebalance.org. And it's really just remarkable to try to shift your mindset. It changed a ton how I interact with my kids, and the teachers I know who have used it say the same thing. So I'm really happy to say that OSPI is working with Lives in the Balance as part of the inclusionary work that they're doing now under a budget proviso. And so those are the practices that really dramatically reduce restraint and isolation and make everybody feel better at school, the kids and the adults. So that's why we need to keep that OSPI funding in there.
Yes, it's so important.
So that was added to the bill. Also, quarterly safety net payments and the statewide IEP system and the technical fix that penalized districts with more inclusion. But the multiplier increases are just abysmal. For K through 12, the multiplier goes from 1.12 to 1.18 and 1.06 to 1.09, depending on how much the kids are in the classroom.
That is crazy.
Yeah, tiny.
Yeah.
And doesn't remove the freaking cap.
Yeah.
Which is a reversal, as you were saying. Used to be the House that was in favor of removing the cap.
Yeah.
And now it seems to be the Senate.
Yeah. Which reminds me, there is still a Senate special education bill, which is now on its second substitution. So technically, it's second substitute Senate Bill 5263, which is sponsored by Majority Leader Jamie Peterson and Minority Leader John Braun. Henceforth, I will refer to it as 5263 because, wow, is that a mouthful. This is the Senate version of 1310. It did make it out of Ways and Means in a substituted form that also got scaled back. The multiplier would be 1.32 across the board. So it's just a scaled back version of its former self.
And it does remove the cap.
Yes, it removes the cap, and it has that crucial funding in there for OSPI to do training around inclusionary practices.
Yes, and it lowers the safety net threshold more. So there's a couple of important ways that it's better than the House bill right now.
Yep. And I think it's also important to flag again who's sponsoring that bill. I think that's going to help it move because the next hurdles have to do with the Rules Committee, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, it's just leadership exercising control over what ultimately gets voted on. And if leadership is sponsoring a bill, that ups the chances of it getting out of rules.
That's right. Because this bill is sponsored by Senator Peterson and Senator Braun, it is relatively sure to get to the floor and get a hearing and a vote.
Yep.
So let's talk about MSOC.
Yes, MSOC.
Materials, supplies, and operating costs. Keeping the lights on money.
Yes, another high drama heartbreaker in the house.
Absolutely.
So MSOC still lives, which I guess is good.
I guess it lives. It's barely recognizable.
Yeah, we're both being tentative about this because it went down from about a 20% bump in MSOC funding for districts to a 0.3% bump, which is like, what?
And we went back and forth. We were like, no, it must be a 3% bump. No, it is a 0.3% increase.
Yeah.
Which is almost like, what's the point? Here's what Rep. Couture said.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Respectfully asking for a no. I guess I'm a little confused with this amendment, why we would even need a bill. With the amount left over afterwards, we're basically spreading pennies across our school districts when they're struggling right now.
I think a lot of people were very angry about this.
Yeah, rightfully so.
Yeah. Mia Gregerson proposed that amendment very matter-of-factly.
Yeah, you've seen a lot of amendments on bills this week to reduce the costs in order for us to really make sure that we have a balanced budget. And that's what this is attempting to do. This has nothing to do with the importance of the work and the importance of the topic and the commitment to this bill. I urge you to pass this amendment. Thank you.
But, wow.
Yeah. So just to put that in a little more perspective, the original bill, it was $300 additional per student, and now it's $5.55 additionally per student. That is crazy. That's not going to touch this ginormous gap that we have in MSOC. Right now, MSOC statewide is underfunded by $613.7 million. A 0.3% bump is not going to do a whole lot. I'm trying to tell myself to stay optimistic because you can add things back into a bill. Funding dials that have been turned down can be turned up. Theoretically, later on in the process, this bill could be like raised to a non-ridiculous amount of funding and have some of the other stuff that we liked added back in. But it is harder to add things back into a bill than it is to strip them out.
Yeah. So before we've even gotten to the floor in the House of Origin, this bill is down to a 0.3% increase per student. And advocates weren't the only ones who were upset. We're just going to play part of the roll call on the vote.
Peterson? Aye. Peterson votes aye. Paulette?
Nay without recommendation.
Paulette votes nay without recommendation. Rude?
Not pass.
Rude votes nay, do not pass. Ryu?
Ryu votes aye.
Ryu votes aye. Springer? Springer votes aye. Stonier? Stonier votes nay without recommendation. Street? Street votes aye. Ty?
Ty votes aye.
Ty votes aye. Derringer?
Aye.
Derringer votes aye. Callan?
No without recommendation.
Callan votes nay without recommendation.
We're switching. We're good.
Does any member wish to change their vote?
Yes.
Mr. Glatz, will you...
Who's changing?
Will you please announce the tally?
Mr. Chair, there are 15 ayes, 16 nays, and 0 excused.
They wanted to change their vote.
Yes.
Well, then say it. Put your mic on.
Representative Paulette?
Yes, I'd like to change my vote from nay without recommendation to yes.
Representative Paulette votes aye.
Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Glatz, will you please announce the tally?
The tally is now 16 ayes, 15 nays, and 0 excused.
By your vote, Substitute House Bill 1338 is reported out to the committee with a do pass recommendation.
Yeah. It's a shell of its former self, and that is sad.
So back to the Senate again.
Yep. Senate bill was decreased, but not as drastically. Like basically all the dials were turned down.
Yeah, we were not liking the Senate bill because it was 10% increase instead of 20%. And now it's decreased to 6%.
Yep.
But 6% is a hell of a lot more than 0.3%.
Yeah. So, yeah, go 5192, I guess. Yeah. I think we're both sounding a little bit dejected this episode because it is so heartbreaking to advocate for stuff, tell our stories, do all of the right things, and it still is a 0.3% increase or the bill that you love dies. It's a really heartbreaking process, and I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Also, though, I want to say that it is a marathon, not a sprint. And there are still things we can do. Like, it is not over until it's over. I was talking to somebody the other day who witnessed in the last several hours of a legislative session, they substituted in the contents of a whole other bill into a shell of a bill. And their thing got passed, like right down to the wire. And that's not super common, but it happens. And it definitely isn't going to happen if we get dejected and stop with our advocacy. So we got to figure out a way to soldier on.
Okay, so that's where we stand. We're rooting for the MSOC bill in the Senate, 5192, and the special ed bill in the Senate, 5263. We are disappointed by and hope to see improved 1357 for special ed in the House and 1338 for MSOC in the House. So what happens next with these bills, Megan?
Right now, all of the bills are sitting in the Rules Committee. I don't think we've talked about rules here before, but both the House and the Senate have a Rules Committee, and it's perhaps most useful to think about that as leadership acting as gatekeepers. So they decide what's going to make it to the floor and what's going to die in rules.
You can watch a Rules Committee meeting in the Senate. They don't air them in the House.
Each member of the committee gets to select 2 or 3 bills that will move on to the next steps in the process.
At each Rules Committee meeting.
Yes.
Which up to now have been about once a week. And I don't know if they increase it at this point or not.
Yeah, I don't know either.
It reminds me of when you're picking teams from a lineup. Like all the bills are lined up and saying, pick me, pick me.
An important deadline to remember is the cutoff date for passage out of the House of Origin is 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 12th. So right now, there's still plenty of time before the March 12th cutoff, but we're going to be keeping a close eye and seeing if there is any opportunity to advocate around these bills.
So after they get picked, then they go to the floor.
Then they go to the floor.
And there's 2 steps on the floor. There's what's obscurely called the second reading, and that's where they do the amendments and substitutions and debate. And then what they call the third reading is the roll call, where everybody votes, and that's what has to be done by March 12th.
Yes. So to recap, the Rules Committee is where our big 3 bills, such as they are all parked. And it's the gatekeeper. Leadership will deploy these bills to the floor or not in an order that they feel is going to be most expeditious to their larger agenda.
And I have an update since we recorded this episode. On Monday, both 5192, the Senate MSOC bill, and 5263, the Senate Special Ed bill, got moved out of Rules Committee and are waiting for a hearing on the floor. That's week 8 of the Big 3 briefing.
Next week, we will keep you updated on any floor action that has happened or what's going on in the Rules Committee. It's starting to get to the point in session where things get pretty crazy pretty fast. So stay tuned.
I guess we'll be facing that House of Origin cutoff next week because it's next Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
And then I guess next Thursday is when the crossover will happen. They start hearing the bills from the opposite house.
Yep.
All right. You can find our show notes and transcripts at rainydayrecess.org.
And please let us know what your thoughts or questions are about any of these bills or the legislature. And you can email us at hello@rainydayrecess.org.
Stay curious, stay cozy, and join us next time on Rainy Day Recess.